He was just a widowed father browsing through a small-town newspaper when he saw a photo that stopped his heart cold. His wife, who had supposedly died in a car accident 3 years ago, smiling back at him from a local community event. She was standing with 2 young ones who weren't his, her arm wrapped protectively around them like a mother. The caption read her name, but listed her as a local resident with no mention of her past. No one believed his frantic claims that the dead could walk among the living. No one except a retired private investigator who had seen stranger things and decided this mystery deserved answers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The coffee had gone cold in Rory Vance's hands as he stared at the newspaper spread across his kitchen table, his world tilting on its axis. There, in black and white, was a photograph that defied everything he thought he knew about life, death, and the cruel finality of loss. His wife, Juniper Shaw Vance, smiled back at him from the pages of the Millbrook Valley Gazette, her arm wrapped around 2 youngsters he'd never seen before, standing in front of the town's annual Harvest Festival booth. Juniper, who had been declared dead 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days ago. Rory's hands trembled as he read the caption. Beneath the photo, local volunteers, Juniper Shaw and her little ones helped distribute care packages at this year's Millbrook Valley Harvest Festival. Shaw, a beloved member of our community for the past 2 years, has been instrumental in organizing various charitable events throughout the valley. Shaw, not Shaw Vance. Just Shaw. The newspaper crinkled as his grip tightened. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. He'd buried his wife, or what they'd told him were her remains, in Oakwood Cemetery after the horrific car accident on Route 47. He'd stood at her graveside every week for 3 years, talking to a headstone that bore her name, her dates, and the simple inscription, "Beloved wife and mother." Mother to their daughter Emma, who was now 8 years old and asking fewer and fewer questions about why Mommy never came home. Rory pushed back from the table so violently that his chair scraped against the hardwood floor. The sound echoed through the quiet house, a house that had felt hollow since that terrible night when the police knocked on his door, wearing expressions that immediately told him his life was about to shatter into a million irreparable pieces. He grabbed the newspaper and held it closer to his face, studying every detail of the photograph. The woman's face was slightly turned, but he could see enough. The delicate curve of her jawline, the way she tucked her hair behind her left ear, the small scar above her right eyebrow from when she fell off her bike as a teenager. She'd told him that story on their second date, laughing as she traced the barely visible mark with her finger. This was Juniper. This was his wife, but it was also impossible. Rory sank back into his chair, his mind racing through the events of that night 3 years ago. The phone call from the hospital, the rushed drive through rain-slicked streets, the cold, sterile room where a doctor with kind eyes had explained that the accident had been severe. The car had caught fire, and the identification had been made through dental records and personal effects found at the scene. He'd never actually seen the body. They'd told him it would be better to remember her as she was. Now, staring at the photograph, Rory wondered if that had been the first lie in a series of lies that had stolen 3 years of his life and convinced him to mourn a woman who might have been alive all along. His phone buzzed on the counter. A text from his neighbor, Mrs. Blackwood. "Don't forget, Emma's soccer practice is at 4. I can pick her up from school if you're running late." Emma, sweet, resilient Emma, who had stopped asking when Mommy was coming home sometime during the 2nd year, who had learned to braid her own hair because Daddy's fingers were too clumsy with the small elastics, who had grown 3 inches and lost 2 teeth while her mother, if this was really her mother, had been living in a town barely 90 miles away, caring for someone else's family. Rory's chest tightened with a mixture of hope and rage so potent it made him dizzy. If Juniper was alive, where had she been? Why hadn't she come home? And who were those two youngsters she was holding so protectively, as if they belonged to her? He studied the photo again, this time focusing on the background details. The festival looked recent. The autumn decorations and clothing suggested it was probably from last month. The banner behind them read Millbrook Valley Harvest Festival 2024, confirming his suspicions. She was alive. She was alive and living less than 2 hours away. But there was something else in the photograph that made his stomach clench with dread. The way Juniper looked at the camera, there was no recognition, no awareness that she might be seen by someone from her past. Her smile was genuine but somehow different, like she was looking at the world through new eyes. The woman in this photograph looked content, settled, like someone who had built a life in Millbrook Valley and had no reason to question it, like someone who had no memory of the life she'd left behind. Rory stood up abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the autumn afternoon. Emma would be home from school in 3 hours, expecting help with her math homework and wanting to tell him about her day. She'd probably mentioned the upcoming father-daughter dance at school, the one he'd been dreading because it felt like another reminder of all the mother-daughter moments she'd never have. Except maybe she could have them, if this was really Juniper, if she was really alive. If there was some explanation for why she'd been gone for 3 years without a word, without a sign, without any indication that she remembered the family she'd left behind. The rational part of Rory's mind whispered that he was losing his grip on reality. That grief could play terrible tricks on the human psyche. That seeing his wife's face in strangers was a documented phenomenon among people who had lost someone suddenly and traumatically. But the photograph didn't lie. And every instinct he possessed screamed that the woman in that picture was Juniper Shawvance, the love of his life, the mother of his daughter, the woman whose laugh had filled their home with joy and whose absence had left them both stumbling through an existence that felt more like survival than living. Rory grabbed his keys from the hook by the door, then stopped. He couldn't just drive to Millbrook Valley and confront a woman who might not remember him. He couldn't show up at Emma's school looking like he'd seen a ghost. He needed proof. He needed help. He needed someone who would listen to his impossible story and help him figure out what to do next. But who would believe him? Who would take seriously the claims of a widower who insisted his dead wife was alive and living with a new family? Rory looked at the newspaper one more time, memorizing every detail of Juniper's face, the way she stood, the protective curve of her arm around those youngsters who seemed to adore her. Somewhere in Millbrook Valley, the woman he'd loved and lost was living a life that didn't include him. And somehow, someway, he was going to find out why. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Rory Vance's determination burned hotter than it had in 3 long, lonely years. The conversation with his brother Silas didn't go the way Rory had hoped. "You need to hear how this sounds," Silas said, setting his coffee mug down on Rory's kitchen counter with more force than necessary. It was early Sunday morning, and Emma was still at her sleepover, which had given Rory the perfect opportunity to show someone else the newspaper photo that had been burning a hole in his mind for 2 days. "You're telling me that Juniper, who we buried 3 years ago, is alive and living in some small town with someone else's kids?" "I'm telling you that's what it looks like," Rory replied, spreading the newspaper out between them again. "Look at her face, Silas. Really look at it." Silas studied the photo with the patience of someone humoring a family member who might be having a breakdown. He was 2 years older than Rory, broader through the shoulders, with the kind of steady presence that had made him the family mediator since they were teenagers. Right now, that steadiness felt like a wall between them. "It's a grainy newspaper photo. Rory, this woman has similar hair color and maybe some facial features that remind you of Juniper. But the scar," Rory interrupted, pointing to the barely visible mark above the woman's right eyebrow, "from when she fell off her bike when she was 14. And look at her hands, the way she's holding that little girl. Those are Juniper's hands." Silas was quiet for a long moment, and Rory felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, his brother was starting to see what he saw. But then Silas sat back in his chair and shook his head. Even if this woman looked exactly like Juniper, which she doesn't, not really, you're talking about a massive conspiracy here. You're saying the police, the hospital, the coroner, the funeral home, all of them were either incompetent or lying. You're saying someone else died in that car accident and was buried under Juniper's name while she somehow ended up with amnesia in a town 90 miles away? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When Silas laid it out like that, it did sound insane. Rory had spent most of Saturday night trying to construct a logical sequence of events that could explain how his wife could be both dead and alive. And every scenario he'd imagined sounded like the plot of a bad movie. Maybe the identification was wrong, Rory said, but his voice lacked conviction. Maybe the dental records got mixed up, or, Rory. Silas's tone was gentle but firm. You identified her personal effects yourself. Her wedding ring, her purse, the necklace she always wore. You said they showed you everything they found in the car. The necklace. Rory's stomach clenched as he remembered that detail. It had been a simple silver chain with a small heart pendant, nothing expensive or unique. But Juniper had worn it every day since their first anniversary. He'd seen it around the neck of the woman they'd told him was his wife, lying in that hospital room where he'd been allowed only the briefest of final goodbyes. But what if someone else had been wearing a similar necklace? What if the real Juniper had given hers away or lost it? Or, you're spiraling, Silas observed, his voice cutting through Rory's increasingly desperate mental gymnastics. I can see it happening. This is what grief does sometimes, especially when anniversaries come around. It's been 3 years, and Emma's growing up, and maybe you're finally starting to process everything you've been too busy to feel. This isn't about grief, Rory snapped, but even as he said it, doubt crept in around the edges of his certainty. This is about my wife being alive, is it? Silas leaned forward, his expression serious. Or is this about you not being ready to let her go? Because I've been watching you for 3 years, and you haven't dated anyone. You haven't even considered the possibility of moving on. You still wear your wedding ring. You still talk about her in the present tense sometimes. Rory's hand moved instinctively to the gold band on his left finger, the one he'd never seriously considered removing. Because she's my wife. Because she was your wife, Silas corrected. And I understand why letting go feels impossible. She was the love of your life, and you had plans, and Emma needed her mother. But chasing fantasies isn't going to bring her back, and it's definitely not going to help Emma. The mention of Emma hit Rory like a physical blow. What do you mean? I mean, what happens when you drive to this town and discover that this woman is a stranger who happens to look a little bit like Juniper? What happens when you come home and have to explain to your 8-year-old daughter that Daddy thought he'd found Mommy, but it was all a mistake? What happens to her trust in you, in the stability you've worked so hard to build? Rory hadn't considered that. In his desperate hope that the impossible might be true, he hadn't thought about the collateral damage if he was wrong. Emma had finally stopped having nightmares about losing her remaining parent. She'd stopped asking when Mommy was coming home. She'd found a kind of peace in their life together, and here he was, ready to shatter it based on a newspaper photograph. And the wild hope that death might have made an exception for his family. And what if you're right? Silas continued, pressing his advantage. What if this woman is somehow Juniper, and she's living with amnesia? What if she doesn't remember you or Emma? What if she's built a new life with new people, and your showing up destroys whatever peace she's found? What if forcing her to remember causes more trauma than leaving her alone? Each question landed like a punch. Rory stared at the newspaper. Photo, trying to imagine walking up to this woman, this stranger who looked like his wife, and telling her that her entire life was a lie. What if she was happy? What if the two youngsters in the photo loved her and depended on her? What right did he have to destroy their family in order to potentially rebuild his own? "I know you miss her," Silas said, his voice softer now. "We all miss her. Juniper was... she was special. She lit up every room she walked into, and losing her changed all of us. But you can't bring her back by convincing yourself that every woman who remotely resembles her might be her." "This is different," Rory insisted, but the words felt hollow. "Now, is it? Because last year, you were convinced you saw her at Emma's school carnival. The year before that, it was a woman at the grocery store. You've been seeing Juniper everywhere for 3 years, and every time, it's been someone else." Rory's cheeks burned with embarrassment and anger. Those other times had been different, fleeting glimpses, moments of hopeful delusion that he'd quickly talked himself out of. This wasn't the same thing. This woman wasn't just a stranger who shared a few features with his wife. This was Juniper's face, Juniper's hands, Juniper's smile. But what if Silas was right? What if grief had finally twisted his perception so completely that he was seeing his wife in newspaper photos of random women? What if he was losing his mind in slow motion, and the only person who would pay the price was Emma? "Think about your daughter," Silas said, standing up and placing a firm hand on Rory's shoulder. "Think about the life you've built together. How far you've both come. Don't throw that away chasing ghosts." After Silas left, Rory sat alone in his kitchen, staring at the newspaper photo until the ink seemed to blur together. Maybe his brother was right. Maybe this was just another manifestation of grief that refused to run its course. Maybe he was so desperate to believe in miracles that he was willing to see them where they didn't exist. But as the afternoon light shifted across the photograph, illuminating the woman's face in a way that made her features even more distinct, Rory felt his doubt wavering. The rational part of his mind agreed with everything Silas had said. The desperate, loving part of his heart whispered that some things were worth the risk of being wrong. The question was, which part of himself should he trust? Emma would be home in 2 hours, full of stories about her sleepover and excited about her upcoming piano recital. She would expect him to be the stable, reliable father he'd worked so hard to become. But 90 miles away, a woman who looked exactly like her mother was living a life that didn't include them. Rory folded the newspaper and put it back in the drawer, his decision still unmade. His heart still breaking with the weight of impossible hope. The coffee shop on Elm Street buzzed with the usual Monday morning energy business suits, grabbing their caffeine fix. Students hunched over laptops, retirees settling in for their daily social hour. Rory sat in the corner booth, the same newspaper spread before him for what felt like the 100th time, when a gravelly voice interrupted his obsessive study of the photograph. "That's quite a puzzle you've got there." Rory looked up to find a man in his early 60s standing beside his table, holding a steaming mug and wearing the kind of weathered expression that suggested he'd seen more than his share of life's complications. The stranger was tall, with silver-streaked hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "I'm sorry," Rory said, instinctively moving to cover the newspaper. "Mind if I sit?" The man gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Name's Pox Thorne. I couldn't help but notice you've been staring at that same page for the better part of 20 minutes. And the look on your face suggests it's not because you're fascinated by the local Harvest Festival coverage." Something about Pox's directness put Rory slightly at ease, though he remained cautious. "It's nothing interesting. Just reading about community events." Pox settled into the booth and took a sip of his coffee, studying Rory with the kind of attention that made him feel like he was being quietly assessed. 23 years on the police force, another 15 as a private investigator, Pox said conversationally. "You develop an eye for people wrestling with impossible situations." And brother, you look like a man who's seen something that doesn't fit with everything he thought he knew about the world. Rory's hand moved protectively over the newspaper. What makes you think that? The way you're gripping that paper like it might disappear if you let go. The fact that you've been coming here every morning this week, sitting in the same spot, looking at the same page. And mostly, the expression on your face, I've seen it before, usually on people who've stumbled across evidence that their entire understanding of reality might be wrong. Despite himself, Rory felt a flicker of hope. Here was someone who seemed to understand the weight of impossible discoveries, someone who didn't immediately dismiss what couldn't be easily explained. You said you were a private investigator? Rory asked carefully. Retired mostly. But I still take on cases that interest me, particularly the ones that other people are too quick to dismiss as impossible. Pox leaned back in his seat. What's in that newspaper that's got you so twisted up? Rory hesitated. After Silas's reaction, he'd almost convinced himself to drop the whole thing, to trust his brother's rational assessment and focus on the life he'd built with Emma. But something about Pox's calm confidence made him want to try one more time. If I showed you something, would you look at it with an open mind? Son, in my line of work, an open mind is the difference between solving cases and walking away empty-handed. Show me what you've got. What you've got. Slowly, Rory turned the newspaper around, pointing to the Harvest Festival photograph. The woman in the center with the two kids. Do you see anything unusual about her? Pox studied the photo with professional attention, his eyes moving systematically across every detail. Local volunteer, according to the caption. Juniper Shaw, pretty woman, looks like she's good with kids. He looked up at Rory. What am I supposed to be seeing? That woman is my wife, Rory said quietly. My wife, who died in a car accident 3 years ago. To his credit, Pox didn't laugh or immediately dismiss the claim. Instead, he looked at the photo again, then at Rory, then back at the photo. You're certain? I've been staring at that face for 10 years. I know every freckle, every expression line, every angle. Rory's voice grew stronger as he spoke. That scar above her right eyebrow, the way she tilts her head when she's listening, the shape of her hands, that's Juniper. That's my wife. Poxa was quiet for a long moment, still studying the photograph. Tell me about the accident. Rory found himself recounting the whole story. The phone call from the hospital, the rushed drive through the rain, the doctor's explanation about the fire, and the identification through dental records and personal effects. Pox listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. You never saw the body? Pox asked when Rory finished. They said it would be better to remember her as she was. The fire had been extensive, and the identification was based entirely on dental records and personal effects found at the scene. Her wedding ring, her purse, a necklace she always wore. The dental records matched what her dentist had on file. Pox leaned back, his expression thoughtful. In my experience, when someone dies in a car fire severe enough to require dental identification, there are usually other factors that make the case complicated. Multiple victims, confusion at the scene, pressure to identify remains quickly for grieving families. You think there could have been a mistake? I think mistakes happen more often than people want to admit, especially in traumatic situations. Pox pulled out his phone and made a note. What was your wife's full name? Juniper Shawvance. But in the newspaper, she's listed as just Juniper Shaw. That's interesting. Could be a coincidence, could be significant. Pox looked at the photo. Again, these two kids with her, do you know anything about them? I've never seen them before. But the way she's holding them, the way she's looking at them, it's like they're hers. What does your family think about all this? Rory's face fell. My brother thinks I'm losing my mind. He says it's grief, that I've been seeing Juniper and strangers for 3 years. And this is just the latest delusion. Have you been seeing her in strangers for 3 years? A couple of times maybe. But those were just glimpses, moments when someone's profile or laugh reminded me of her. This is different. This isn't a resemblance, this is her. Pox was quiet for another long moment, and Rory felt his heart sinking. Here was another person who was going to tell him he was chasing fantasies. Another voice of reason that would confirm his brother's assessment. 28 years ago, Pox said finally, I worked a case where a woman's husband was declared dead in a construction accident. Closed casket funeral, life insurance payout, the whole thing. 2 years later, she spotted him working at a gas station 3 states away. Turned out there had been a mix-up with the bodies, and he'd been suffering from amnesia after a head injury. He'd been living under a different name, with no memory of his previous life. Rory's breath caught. What happened? It took months of gentle reintroduction, medical treatment, and patience, but eventually, most of his memories came back. Not all of them, but enough. They rebuilt their life together, stronger than before. Pox met Rory's eyes. I learned that impossible and unlikely are 2 very different things. So you believe me? I believe that you believe what you're telling me. And I believe that the photo shows a woman who bears a striking resemblance to your wife. Whether those 2 facts are connected remains to be determined. Pox pulled out a business card and slid it across the table. But I think it's worth finding out. Rory picked up the card, his hands trembling slightly. What would you need to do? First, I'd want to verify the details of the original accident police reports, coroner's findings, hospital records. Then I'd want to do some discreet investigation into this Juniper Shaw in Millbrook Valley. Find out how long she's been there, where she came from, whether she has any memory of life before arriving in town. And if she really is my wife, then we figure out the best way to approach her without causing trauma to anyone involved, not her, not those kids, and not your daughter. Pox's expression grew serious. But I need you to understand something. If we do this, we do it right. No showing up at her door demanding answers. No confronting her in public. This kind of situation requires patience and professional handling. Rory nodded eagerly. Whatever it takes. And you need to be prepared for any outcome. If this woman is your wife, she might not remember you. If she's not your wife, you'll need to accept that and find a way to move forward. And if she is your wife but she's built a new life that she doesn't want to leave, you'll need to respect that too. The weight of those possibilities settled on Rory's shoulders, but for the first time in days, he felt like he wasn't carrying the burden alone. When can we start? He asked. Pox smiled, and it was the kind of smile that suggested he'd found a puzzle worth solving. How about right now? Pox Thorne's office occupied the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian house on Maple Street, its windows overlooking the town square where autumn leaves drifted down like scattered memories. The space felt lived in, and purposeful filing cabinets lined one wall. A large desk dominated the center of the room, and a corkboard covered in photographs and newspaper clippings suggested ongoing investigations that defied easy categorization. Coffees. Fresh, Pox said, gesturing toward a machine that looked like it had survived several decades of constant use. We're going to be here a while. Rory accepted the offered mug gratefully, settling into a leather chair that had molded itself to accommodate countless clients seeking answers to impossible questions. On the desk between them, Pox had already spread out a yellow legal pad, several manila folders, and his laptop. First thing we need to do is verify everything you think you know about your wife's death, Pox said, pulling up a database on his computer screen. Date of the accident? October 15th, 3 years ago. Around 9:30 p.m. on Route 47, about 12 miles outside of town. Pox's fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. Weather conditions that night? Heavy rain. That's What they said contributed to the accident: poor visibility, slick roads. Vehicle involved? Her Honda Civic, silver, 2018. Rory's voice caught slightly. She just picked it up from the shop that afternoon. New brake pads. The irony of that detail had haunted him for 3 years. Fresh brakes that hadn't been enough to prevent disaster. Police. Report shows. Pox squinted at his screen, scrolling through official records. Single vehicle accident. Car left the roadway and struck a tree before catching fire. Responding officers were Sergeant Wyatt Croft and Officer Dahlia Vance. Wait, Vance? My cousin, Rory confirmed. She was one of the first on scene. She's the one who called me. Pox made a note. That could be significant. Family member on scene, emotional situation, pressure to provide closure quickly. He continued reading. Fire department response time was ... 18 minutes. Rural location, nearest station was 12 miles away. By the time they got there, the car was completely engulfed. According to this, the vehicle burned for over 40 minutes before they could fully extinguish it. Fire was so intense it took 3 days for the scene to cool enough for complete investigation. Pox leaned back in his chair. That's a lot of destruction. Makes accurate identification much more challenging. He pulled up another database, this one showing coroner's reports. Dr. Elias Finch performed the initial examination. Says here that dental identification was complicated by significant thermal damage to maxillofacial structure. What does that mean? Means the fire was hot enough to damage even the teeth. Dental identification usually relies on comparing dental work fillings, crowns, root canals to existing records, but extreme heat can destroy those markers. Rory felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through the old windows. So the identification might not have been definitive? Let's keep digging. Pox opened another file. Personal effects recovered from the scene. Wedding ring, engraved R&J forever. That's yours? I had it engraved for our first anniversary. Purse containing driver's license, credit cards, and various personal items. Silver necklace with heart pendant. Pox looked up. You mentioned this necklace was something she wore daily? Every day since our first anniversary. It wasn't expensive. Just something I picked up at a jewelry store in the mall, but she loved it. Here's the thing about personal effects in car fires, Pox said, making more notes. Items get thrown around during impact, scattered by emergency responders, sometimes picked up and moved by well-meaning bystanders. The fact that these items were found doesn't necessarily mean they were worn by the victim at the time of the accident. But her purse, her license ... could have been in the car regardless of who was driving it. Pox's expression was carefully neutral. I'm not saying that's what happened, just that we need to consider all possibilities. He turned to a fresh page in his legal pad. Now let's look at what we know about Juniper Shaw in Millbrook Valley. His fingers flew across the keyboard again. Property records show a Juniper Shaw renting a small house on Birchwood Lane starting November 2021. That's roughly 1 month after your wife's accident. Rory's heart hammered against his ribs. 1 month? Could be coincidence, could be significant. Pox pulled up a different database. No credit history for Juniper Shaw prior to November 2021. No employment records. No school transcripts. No medical records. It's like she appeared out of nowhere. What about the 2 kids in the photograph? Working on that. Pox made a phone call, speaking in low tones to someone he addressed as Gwen. After a few minutes of conversation, he hung up and turned back to Rory. Local contact in Millbrook Valley. Juniper Shaw is known in the community as a single mother who moved to town about 3 years ago. She works part-time at Thornfield Books, volunteers at the local library, and is generally well regarded by neighbors. Single mother, Rory repeated. So she's raising those 2 youngsters alone? According to my contact, yes. The kids are approximately 6 and 8 years old, a boy named Lachlan and a girl named Corliss. No father in the picture, and Juniper has never mentioned their father or her life before coming to Millbrook Valley. The names meant nothing to Rory, but the ages made his chest tighten. 6 and 8, close to Emma's age. If Juniper really was alive and suffering from amnesia, she might be unconsciously drawn to caring for youngsters the same age as the daughter she couldn't remember. There's something else, Pox continued, consulting his notes. My contact says Juniper was found by local police 3 years ago, wandering along Highway 92 about 15 miles outside Millbrook Valley. She was disoriented, couldn't remember her name or where she'd come from. No identification, no personal belongings. Highway 92, Rory said slowly. That connects to Route 47, doesn't it? Pox pulled up a map on his computer. Route 47 intersects with Highway 92, about 20 miles from the accident site. If someone survived that crash and wandered in a confused state, she could have ended up on Highway 92. It's possible. Pox's tone remained carefully professional, but Rory could see the investigators' excitement building. Local police in Millbrook Valley tried to identify her through missing persons databases, but nothing came up. Eventually she was placed with a local family, the Becketts, who helped her get back on her feet. What about the 2 kids? Where did they come from? That's where it gets interesting. Lachlan and Corliss were already in foster care with the Becketts when Juniper arrived. Their parents died in a house fire the same month as your wife's accident. The Becketts were temporary guardians, but when it became clear Juniper had bonded with the youngsters and they with her, social services allowed her to become their permanent guardian. Rory stared at the timeline Pox had sketched out on the legal pad. October 15th, Juniper's supposed death. November, mysterious woman found on highway, placed with foster family caring for recently orphaned siblings. December, woman with no memory of her past becomes permanent guardian to 2 grieving kids who'd lost their parents the same month Rory lost his wife. It fits, Rory whispered. All of it fits. It's circumstantial, Pox warned, but his tone suggested he was starting to believe in the impossible too. We need more proof before we can be certain. What kind of proof? Pox closed his laptop and leaned forward. I want to drive to Millbrook Valley tomorrow. Discreet surveillance. Maybe approach some locals who know her, see if we can learn more about her behavior, her mannerisms, anything that might confirm or rule out your theory. I'm coming with you. Absolutely not. Pox's tone was firm. If this woman is your wife, the last thing we want is for her to spot you before we understand the situation. If she really has amnesia, seeing you could trigger a psychological crisis. If she's not your wife, we don't want to traumatize some innocent woman by having her husband's doppelganger stalking her. Rory wanted to argue, but he could see the wisdom in Pox's approach. How long will it take? A few days, maybe a week. I want to be thorough. Pox gathered his notes into a folder. In the meantime, I need you to get me everything you can about your wife's medical history. Dental records, any identifying marks or scars. And I need you to prepare yourself mentally for whatever we might find. What do you mean? I mean, if this woman is Juniper, she's built a life that doesn't include you. She's caring for 2 youngsters who depend on her, living in a community where she's found acceptance and purpose. Even if we can prove she's your wife, we can't just tear her away from everything she's built and expect her to slot back into her old life. The weight of that possibility settled on Rory's shoulders like lead. But what about Emma? What about our family? That's what we need to figure out. Pox stood and walked to the window, looking out at the autumn afternoon. Sometimes the miracle isn't getting back what you lost. Sometimes it's finding a way to build something new from the pieces that remain. Outside, leaves continued their silent dance toward the ground. And somewhere 90 miles away, a woman who might be the love of Rory's life was living a life that had no room for the husband and daughter who'd never stopped missing her dot. But for the first time in 3 years, Rory had hoped that the story wasn't over. Tomorrow, Pox would drive to Millbrook Valley, and they would begin to discover whether love really could find a way home. Pox called Rory at 3:47 p.m. on Wednesday, and the tone of his voice immediately told Rory that everything had changed. "I need you to sit down," Pox said without preamble. Rory was at his workshop, sanding the edges of a custom bookshelf, but he immediately set down his tools and found a chair. "What did you find?" "I've been watching her for 3 days. Discreet. Surveillance, just observing her daily routines, her interactions with the community, her behavior with those 2 kids. Pox's voice was carefully controlled, but Rory could hear the underlying excitement. "Rory, it's her. It's definitely her." The words hit Rory like a physical blow. For all his hope, for all his certainty, when he'd first seen the photograph, part of him had still expected Pox to call and confirm that he'd been chasing shadows. Hearing definitive confirmation that his wife was alive, that she'd been living 90 miles away for 3 years, left him breathless. How can you be sure? Dozen small things that individually might be coincidence, but together paint a picture that's impossible to ignore. Pox's voice took on the professional tone of someone presenting evidence. First, her mannerisms. The way she tucks her hair behind her left ear when she's thinking. The way she tilts her head slightly to the right when someone's talking to her. The way she walks, there's a barely perceptible limp in her left leg that matches the injury reports from your wife's medical records. Rory remembered that limp. Juniper had broken her ankle in high school, and it had never quite healed properly. On cold mornings, she'd favor that leg slightly, something only someone who knew her intimately would notice. But that's not the most convincing evidence, Pox continued. Yesterday afternoon, I was parked across from Thornfield Books when she came out during her lunch break. She was carrying a cup of coffee, and when she got to the crosswalk, she started humming. Humming? Moon. River. Same song you told me she used to hum when she was doing dishes or folding laundry. But here's the thing, she was humming it in the exact same key, with the same little vocal quirks you described. The way she draws out the word wherever and adds that small trill on going. Rory's chest tightened. He'd mentioned those details to Pox almost as an afterthought, little habits that had made Juniper uniquely herself. To hear that this woman shared not just physical characteristics, but the same unconscious musical patterns felt like proof beyond coincidence. "There's more," Pox said. "I followed her to the library where she volunteers. She was reading to a group of young ones, and I positioned myself where I could hear her voice clearly. Rory, she has the same laugh, not similar, identical. That soft musical laugh that starts low and builds up. And when one of the kids asked her a question, she answered in exactly the way you described your wife speaking to Emma Patient. Gentle, but with that underlying playfulness. What about the kids she's with, Lachlan and Corliss? That's where it gets really interesting." Pox's tone shifted, becoming more serious. "I watched her interact with them for hours. The way she smooths the boy's hair when he's upset. The way she automatically reaches for the girl's hand when they're crossing the street. The way she cuts their sandwiches diagonally and removes the crusts without being asked. These aren't learned behaviors, Rory. These are maternal instincts. That suggests she's cared for youngsters before." Rory thought about all the times he'd watched Juniper with Emma, the unconscious way she'd known exactly how to comfort their daughter, anticipate her needs, respond to her moods. If Juniper really had amnesia but was still displaying those same nurturing patterns. But here's the clincher, Pox said, and Rory could hear him shuffling papers. "This morning, I was at the coffee shop across from her house when she came out to check her mail. She was wearing a long-sleeved shirt, but when she reached up to the mailbox, the sleeve pulled back slightly. Rory, she has a scar on her left wrist. Thin, about 2 inches long, right where you told me your wife had that scar from the broken picture frame accident. The picture frame." Rory remembered it perfectly. A clumsy accident during their first year of marriage, when Juniper had tried to hang a wedding photo and the glass had shattered, cutting her wrist deeply enough to require stitches. The scar had faded over the years but never completely disappeared. "There's no doubt in my mind," Pox continued. "This woman is Juniper Vance. The question now is what we do about it." Rory stood up from his chair, pacing the small space of his workshop as the reality of the situation crashed over him. His wife was alive. She was living in another town, caring for 2 orphaned youngsters, apparently with no memory of her previous life. She was alive, and she was less than 2 hours away. "What's her condition like? Does she seem happy?" Pox was quiet for a moment. "She seems content. The amnesia appears to be comprehensive. I haven't observed any signs that she recognizes her surroundings as unfamiliar or that she's struggling with missing memories. She's integrated into the community, has established routines, genuine relationships. The kids clearly adore her, and she's devoted to them. So she's built a life, a good life. That's what makes this complicated." Pox's voice carried a note of warning. "Rory, I need you to understand what we're dealing with here. This isn't just about reuniting with your wife. She's not the same person who left your house 3 years ago. She's someone who's built an identity around being Juniper Shaw, single, mother to Lachlan and Corliss. Approaching this wrongly could be devastating for everyone involved. But she's still Juniper. She's still Emma's mother, still my wife. Legally, yes. Emotionally, psychologically, ... That's more complex. I did some research into amnesia cases yesterday. Even when memories return, the personality changes that happen during the forgotten period often remain. She's been shaped by 3 years of experiences that don't include you or Emma." Rory sank back into his chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd discovered. "What do we do now? We need to approach this carefully, with professional help. I have contacts at the regional medical center who specialize in traumatic amnesia. We should consult with them before making any direct contact. How long will that take?" "A few days, maybe a week. But Rory, there's something else you need to consider. What if we tell her who she is, and she doesn't want to come back? What if her memories return, but she chooses to stay with the life she's built? What if remembering her past destroys the peace she's found?" The questions hung in the air like accusations. Rory had been so focused on the possibility of getting Juniper back that he hadn't fully considered what it might cost her, or Lachlan and Corliss, who would lose the only mother they'd known. "And what about Emma?" Rory asked quietly. "What do I tell her? Nothing yet. Not until we know more about how to proceed. This kind of revelation needs to be handled with extreme care." After Pox hung up, Rory sat in his workshop surrounded by the smell of sawdust and the half-finished projects that represented the life he'd built in Juniper's absence. She was alive. The impossible had turned out to be true. But instead of the pure joy he'd expected to feel, he was overwhelmed by the complexity of what came next. Somewhere in Millbrook Valley, his wife was making dinner for 2 youngsters who called her mother, reading them bedtime stories, tucking them in with the same gentle care she'd once shown Emma. She was living a life of purpose and love, blissfully unaware that 90 miles away, her husband and daughter had spent 3 years mourning her death. The miracle he'd prayed for had arrived, but it came wrapped in questions that had no easy answers. How do you reclaim a love that doesn't remember you exist? How do you rebuild a family when everyone involved has learned to live without you? And how do you balance the joy of the impossible with the responsibility of protecting the innocent? Tomorrow, Pox would start making calls to medical specialists. Tonight, Rory would look at his sleeping daughter and wonder how to tell her that miracles were more complicated than either of them had ever imagined. The meeting happened on a Saturday morning at Millbrook Valley's farmers market, under the careful orchestration of Dr. Fiona Reed. The neuropsychologist Pox had consulted about traumatic amnesia cases. She'd agreed to facilitate the initial contact, believing that a controlled environment with witnesses and easy escape routes would minimize potential psychological trauma. Rory stood behind a display of autumn apples, his hands trembling as he watched Juniper browse the vegetable stand 60 feet away. Lachlan and Corliss flanked her like small satellites, the boy examining pumpkins with scientific intensity while the girl collected fallen leaves in a paper bag. Even from this distance, even after 3 years, Rory would have recognized his wife's posture anywhere, the slight forward lean when she was concentrating, the way she absently tucked her hair behind her ear. "Remember the plan," Dr. Reed murmured beside him. "Approach slowly. Let me make the initial contact. Don't use her name immediately. We need to gauge her reaction carefully." Pac stood 10 feet away, positioned to intervene if the situation spiraled beyond control. He'd spent the past hour running through contingency plans. What to do if Juniper panicked? If the youngsters became upset? If someone in the crowd recognized the dramatic nature of what was unfolding? "She's moving toward the flower stand," Dr. Reed observed. "That's our cue." Rory's legs felt like lead as he walked across the market square. 3 years of grief, hope, and desperate longing condensed into these 40 steps that separated him from the woman he'd mourned, buried, and never stopped loving. With each footfall, his certainty that this was the right thing to do battled with terror about what might happen next. Juniper was examining a bouquet of sunflowers when Dr. Reed approached, Rory hanging back just far enough to observe without being immediately noticed. "Excuse me," Dr. Reed said in the casual tone they'd rehearsed. "I'm Dr. Reed from the Regional Medical Center. I'm conducting research on community integration programs, and I understand you've been involved in local volunteer work." Juniper looked up with the same polite smile she'd always used with strangers, but Rory's breath caught as he saw her face clearly for the first time in 3 years. She was thinner than he remembered, with new lines around her eyes that spoke of experiences he hadn't shared. Her hair was shorter, styled differently, and she wore clothes he'd never seen before. But the fundamental architecture of her face, the warm brown eyes that had watched him fumble through a marriage proposal, the mouth that had whispered, "I love you," 1,000 times, everything that made her uniquely herself remained unchanged. "I volunteer at the library," Juniper said, her voice carrying the same musical quality that had narrated bedtime stories to Emma, "and I help with community events when I can. Are you looking for volunteers for a medical program?" "Something like that," Dr. Reed replied, glancing almost imperceptibly at Rory. "Actually, I was wondering if you might be willing to speak with someone who's been searching for people with experiences similar to yours. Someone who's been looking for answers about memory and family connections." Juniper's expression grew curious rather than suspicious. "I'm not sure I understand." "There's someone here who believes you might be able to help him with something very important," Dr. Reed said carefully. "Would you be willing to meet him?" "Mama, can we get the sunflowers?" Corliss tugged at Juniper's jacket, her voice bright with the impatience of an 8-year-old ready to move on to the next interesting thing. "In a minute, sweetheart," Juniper said, automatically smoothing the girl's hair in a gesture so familiar that Rory's chest tightened with recognition. She looked back at Dr. Reed. "I suppose that would be fine, as long as the youngsters can stay with me." Dr. Reed nodded to Rory, who stepped forward on legs that felt disconnected from his body. He stopped about 6 feet away, close enough to see the exact shade of brown in Juniper's eyes, far enough to run if this went catastrophically wrong. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Rory cataloged every detail, the small scar above her eyebrow, the way she held her left shoulder slightly higher than her right, the unconscious way she positioned herself protectively between him and the 2 youngsters. She was studying his face with the polite attention someone gives a stranger, but there was something else in her expression, a flicker of confusion that suggested some part of her mind was responding to visual information it couldn't quite process. "Hello," Rory said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Rory Vance." Juniper tilted her head slightly, the same gesture he'd fallen in love with 10 years ago. "I'm Juniper Shaw. These are my youngsters, Lachlan and Corliss." She paused, her brow furrowing slightly. "Have we met before?" "You seem familiar somehow." The word familiar hit Rory like a physical blow. She didn't remember him, but some part of her recognized him. Some deep, unconscious part of her mind was stirring with the memory of love, even if the conscious mind couldn't access it. "In a way," Rory said carefully, following Dr. Reed's script. "I've been looking for someone for a very long time. Someone I lost 3 years ago. Someone who meant everything to me." Juniper's hand moved instinctively to her throat, a nervous gesture Rory remembered from moments when she was processing difficult information. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said softly, "but I'm not sure how I can help you. I've only lived in Millbrook Valley for about 3 years, and before that—" She trailed off, her expression growing distant. "Before that, you don't remember," Rory finished gently. Something shifted in Juniper's posture. Her protective stance around the youngsters became more pronounced, and her eyes sharpened with a wariness that suggested they were approaching dangerous territory. "How do you know about that?" she asked, her voice gaining an edge. "Because," Rory said, his heart hammering so hard he was sure everyone in the market could hear it. 3 years ago, you were in a car accident on Route 47. The authorities thought you died in that accident. But you didn't die. You survived. Somehow, and you ended up here with no memory of where you came from." Lachlan, who had been quietly examining a squash, looked up with sudden interest. "Mama, what's he talking about?" Juniper's face had gone pale, but she kept her voice steady for the youngster's sake. "I think there's been some confusion," she said, but the words lacked conviction. "Your name is Juniper Shaw Vance," Rory continued, his voice gaining strength as he saw the recognition flickering in her eyes. "You were 27 when the accident happened. You have a daughter named Emma, who's now 8 years old. You used to hum Moon River when you did dishes. You collected elephant figurines because you said they represented family bonds that could never be broken." With each detail, Juniper's expression grew more conflicted. Her hand moved unconsciously to her left wrist, tracing the scar that Pox had confirmed days earlier. "You have a scar on your wrist from when you tried to hang our wedding photo and the glass broke," Rory said softly. "And you have another scar above your right eyebrow from falling off your bike when you were 14. Juniper's breathing had become shallow, and she was staring at Rory with an expression of growing recognition mixed with terror. "Mama?" Corliss tugged at her jacket again, sensing the shift in adult energy that youngsters always seem to pick up on. "Are you okay?" Juniper started, then stopped. She looked at Rory with eyes that seemed to be seeing him clearly for the first time. "I know your voice," she whispered. "In dreams, sometimes I hear a voice calling my name, and it sounds like mine," Rory finished. She nodded slowly, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "But that's impossible. I don't remember." "I can't." "You don't have to remember everything right now," Dr. Reed interjected gently. "Memory recovery from trauma takes time. But what's important is that you're safe, you're loved, and you have choices about how to move forward." Juniper looked down at Lachlan and Corliss, who were watching the adult conversation with the wide-eyed attention of youngsters who knew something important was happening but couldn't quite understand what. "These are my youngsters," she said fiercely, her protective instincts overriding her confusion. "Whatever happened before, whatever I might have forgotten, they're my family now." "I know," Rory said, his heart breaking and healing simultaneously. "And I would never do anything to change that. I needed you to know that you have another family too. A daughter who's missed you every single day for 3 years. A husband who never stopped believing you might come home. Juniper's tears were flowing freely now, but she was still standing strong, still protecting the youngsters who depended on her. "What's your daughter's name?" she asked quietly. "Emma," Rory said. "Emma Vance. She's 8 years old, and she has your eyes. And she still talks to your photograph every night before bed." Something cracked in Juniper's expression, a wall that had been built to protect her from a past she couldn't access. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, there was a different quality to her gaze. "Emma," she repeated, and in that single word, Rory heard the echo of recognition, the whisper of love that had survived 3 years of forgetting. "Mama, who's Emma?" Lachlan asked. Juniper looked down at him, then at Corliss, then back at Rory. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite the tears. "Emma," she said slowly, "might be your sister." They moved to a quiet corner of the market, away from the curious glances of other shoppers. Dr. Reed had arranged for folding chairs to be brought over, and now they sat in an awkward circle, Rory clutching his coffee cup like an anchor, Juniper with Lachlan and Corliss pressed close to her sides, and Dr. Reed maintaining her role as gentle facilitator of an impossible conversation. "I need to understand," Juniper said, her voice steady but strained. "You're telling me I had a completely different life before I came here, a husband, a daughter, a home I don't remember." "That's right," Rory confirmed, trying to keep his voice calm despite the surreal nature of explaining someone's life to them. "We were married for 5 years. Emma was 5 when the accident happened. We lived in a blue house on Sycamore Street with a garden you planted yourself." Juniper shook her head slowly. "I don't remember any of that. When I try to think back, before coming to Millbrook Valley, it's like looking into fog. There are shapes, sometimes, feelings that don't connect to anything concrete." "What do you remember about how you came to be here?" Dr. Reed asked gently. Juniper was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently braiding Corliss's hair, a soothing gesture that seemed automatic. "The first clear memory I have is waking up in Millbrook Valley General Hospital. They told me I'd been found on Highway 92, confused and injured. I had a head trauma, some burns on my arms, and I couldn't tell them who I was or where I'd come from." "What kind of injuries?" Rory asked, his heart clenching at the thought of her suffering alone. "Concussion, some cuts from broken glass, first-degree burns on my forearms. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to explain the memory loss." Juniper's hand moved unconsciously to her left temple, where Rory could now see a faint scar he hadn't noticed before. "They kept me for a week, hoping someone would report me missing or that my memory would return naturally. But it didn't," Dr. Reed observed. "No, if anything, trying to remember made everything worse. The doctor said forcing it could cause more psychological damage, so they recommended I focus on building a new life rather than trying to reconstruct the old one." Rory felt a stab of frustration mixed with understanding. While he'd been desperately searching databases and missing person reports, the medical professionals treating his wife had been actively discouraging her from trying to remember their life together. "That's when the Becketts took you in?" he asked. Juniper nodded, a soft smile crossing her face. "Gwen and Uriel Beckett. They were foster parents who had specialized in taking in people who needed temporary placement, adults with disabilities, individuals recovering from trauma. They offered to let me stay with them while I figured out what to do next. And Lachlan and Corliss were already there." "Yes." Juniper's arms tightened protectively around the 2 youngsters, who were listening with the focused attention of people hearing their own origin story. "They'd lost their parents in a house fire just 2 weeks before I arrived. They were scared, traumatized, barely speaking. The Becketts were temporary guardians while social services looked for permanent placement." Lachlan, who had been quiet throughout the conversation, spoke up for the first time. "You sang to us," he said simply, "when we had nightmares. You made us feel safe," Corliss added. Leaning into Juniper's side, Rory watched the interaction and felt his heart expand and break simultaneously. His wife had been caring for 2 grieving youngsters while he and Emma had been grieving her loss. In some cosmic irony, they'd all been healing from trauma at the same time, in different places, unaware of each other's existence. I don't know why, but something about them called to me, Juniper continued, her voice growing stronger. Maybe it was because we were all lost in our own ways. Maybe it was maternal instinct, though I had no conscious memory of being a mother. But when I saw them crying themselves to sleep, when I watched them struggle with their own confusion and loss, I felt needed, purposeful. "Tell him about the elephant," Corliss whispered. Juniper looked puzzled for a moment, then understanding dawned on her face. "Oh, there was an elephant figurine in my pocket when they found me, ceramic about this big." She held up her fingers to show a 2-inch span. "It was the only personal item I had. The hospital gave it back to me, and I kept it on my bedside table." Rory's breath caught. He knew that elephant. It was from Juniper's collection, a piece Emma had painted for her the Mother's Day before the accident. "Lachlan noticed it one day and asked about it," Juniper continued. "I told him it must have been important to me, even though I couldn't remember why. He said maybe it meant I was supposed to take care of things that were precious. After that, he started calling me Mama Elephant. Eventually, it just became Mama," Corliss said, with the matter-of-fact tone of youngsters explaining their world. The Becketts were getting older, and they couldn't handle long-term care for traumatized kids, Juniper explained. "When it became clear that Lachlan and Corliss had bonded with me, and I with them, social services arranged for me to become their legal guardian. We moved into our own place, and I started building a life around being their mother." "Did you ever wonder about your past?" Dr. Reed asked, "Every day at first. But the wondering was painful, and it seemed to upset the youngsters when I was sad or confused. So I chose to focus on the family I had instead of the one I might have lost." Juniper looked directly at Rory. "I chose to believe that if I had people who loved me somewhere, they would find me when the time was right." "And you were happy?" Rory asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. "Yes," Juniper said without hesitation. "Not at first there. Was always this feeling that something was missing, like I was living someone else's life. But Lachlan and Corliss needed me to be whole for them, so I learned to be whole. We built traditions, created memories, became a family. It wasn't the life I'd planned, because I couldn't remember making any plans, but it was a good life." Rory looked at the two youngsters who had claimed his wife's heart and felt an unexpected surge of gratitude. They had given her purpose when she had nothing else. They had loved her when she couldn't remember anyone else who did. In their own way, they had kept her alive and functioning until this moment of rediscovery could happen. "What happens now?" Lachlan asked, the question all of them were thinking. Juniper looked at him, then at Corliss, then at Rory. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I'm starting to remember fragments, not specific memories, but feelings. When you said Emma's name, something inside me recognized it, and your voice." She paused, studying Rory's face. "When you speak, it's like hearing a song I used to know, but can't quite recall all the words to." "We don't have to figure everything out today," Dr. Reed interjected. "Memory recovery is a process. Understanding how to blend two families is a process. There's no timeline except the one that feels right for everyone involved." "I want to know." "About Emma," Juniper said suddenly. "I want to know about the daughter I can't remember having. But I also need you to understand that these two," she gestured to Lachlan and Corliss, "they're not just youngsters I've been caring for, they're my kids. They've been my whole world for 3 years." "I know," Rory said, and he meant it. "I can see how much you love them. And I can see how much they love you. I'm not asking you to choose between families. I'm just asking for a chance to show you the family you forgot." Juniper was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving between Rory and the two youngsters whose lives had become intertwined with hers through shared loss and healing. "Okay," she said finally, "I want to try to remember. But we do this slowly, And we do it in a way that protects everyone, including Emma, including these two, including you." For the first time in 3 years, Rory felt like his family might have a future. It wouldn't be the same family they'd been before, and it wouldn't be simple. But it would be built on love that had survived death, memory loss, and the healing power of caring for others. It would be enough to start with. The first meeting between Juniper and Emma took place 2 weeks later at Millbrook Valley's small park, carefully orchestrated by Dr. Reed to feel natural and unthreatening. Rory arrived with Emma, who had been told that they were meeting someone very special, someone who might help them understand some important things about their family. Emma clutched Rory's hand as they walked toward the picnic table where Juniper sat with Lachlan and Corliss. She'd been unusually quiet since Rory had tried to explain the impossible truth that her mother, who had died when she was 5, was actually alive and living in another town. The concept was too large for an 8-year-old mind to fully grasp, but Emma had listened with the solemn attention she reserved for truly important information. "Is that her?" Emma whispered as they approached. Rory's chest tightened as he watched Juniper look up and see her daughter for the first time in 3 years. Even from 30 feet away, he could see the recognition bloom across her face, not complete memory, but something deeper, a cellular understanding that this young person belonged to her in ways that transcended conscious thought. "Yes, sweetheart, that's your mom." Emma stared at Juniper with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. "She looks different than in the pictures." "People change," Rory said gently, "but the important parts stay the same." When they reached the table, Juniper stood slowly, her hands trembling slightly. She was wearing a blue sweater, Emma's favorite color. Though whether that was coincidence or some unconscious memory, Rory couldn't tell. "Hello, Emma," Juniper said, her voice thick with emotion. "You're so much bigger than I expected." Emma studied her mother's face with the fearless curiosity of youth. "Do you remember me?" "Not the way I should," Juniper answered honestly. "But my heart remembers you. When your father told me your name, something inside me knew it belonged to someone I loved very much." Lachlan and Corliss watched the interaction with wide eyes. They'd been told that Emma was someone very special from their mama's past, but seeing the emotional weight of the meeting seemed to make the situation more real for them. "These are my youngsters, Lachlan and Corliss," Juniper said, her hand moving protectively to rest on Corliss's shoulder. "And this is Emma, who might be your sister." Emma looked at the 2 younger ones with the evaluative gaze of someone accustomed to being an only daughter. "Do you like to read?" she asked Corliss. "I love stories," Corliss responded shyly. "I could teach you to braid friendship bracelets," Emma offered. And just like that, the ice was broken. Within minutes, the 3 youngsters were sharing the playground equipment while the adults watched from the picnic table. "She's beautiful," Juniper said, her eyes never leaving Emma. "She has your smile, but her eyes ... are exactly like yours," Rory finished. "She's stubborn like you too, and artistic. She draws constantly, just like you used to." "I still draw," Juniper said softly. "I do illustrations for the local library's newsletter. I never knew why I was good at it. It just felt natural." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the 3 youngsters navigate the complex social dynamics of becoming potential siblings. Emma was showing Lachlan how to pump his legs on the swing, while Corliss collected interesting leaves to show her new maybe sister. "She's been through so much," Rory said, his voice heavy with 3 years of single parenthood. "The first year after the accident, she barely spoke. She'd sit by your photo and tell it about her day, like you might answer back. She stopped asking when you were coming home, but she never stopped hoping." Juniper's eyes filled with tears. "I should have been there. For her first day of school, for scraped knees, for bad dreams. I should have been there for all of it. You couldn't be, Rory said firmly. And you were doing something important. You were healing yourself and caring for 2 other youngsters who needed you. That matters too. It feels like I abandoned her. You survived. Sometimes that's the most loving thing someone can do. Dr. Reed, who had been observing from a nearby bench, approached their table. How is everyone feeling? Overwhelmed, Juniper admitted, but also hopeful. When I watch Emma with Lachlan and Corliss, something feels right, like pieces clicking into place. That's normal, Dr. Reed assured her. The brain often recognizes patterns and relationships before conscious memory returns. You might find that spending time with Emma triggers more memories. As if summoned by their conversation, Emma ran over to the table, slightly out of breath from playing. Mom, I mean Juniper, do you still know how to braid hair? Dad's terrible at it. Juniper's breath caught at being called Mom, even briefly. I think I remember how. Would you like me to try? Emma nodded eagerly, climbing onto the bench beside Juniper. As Juniper's fingers began working through Emma's tangled auburn hair, muscle memory took over. Her hands moved with practiced confidence, creating the same intricate braid she'd done countless times before the accident. You do remember, Emma said with satisfaction. Dad always makes lumps. I think my hands remember even when my mind doesn't, Juniper said, surprised by her own skill. As she worked, she found herself humming softly, Moon River, the same tune that had provided the soundtrack to 1,000 mundane moments in their old life. Emma's eyes widened. You're humming the song, the one from my music box. Your music box, the one you gave me for my 5th birthday. It plays this song, and Dad said you used to sing it to me. Emma turned to face Juniper, her small hands grasping her mother's wrists. You really are my mom, aren't you? Yes, Juniper whispered, the word carrying the weight of recognition, acceptance, and overwhelming love. I really am. Over the following weeks, they established new routines that honored both families Juniper had built. Saturday afternoons became family time at the park, where Emma, Lachlan, and Corliss learned to navigate their new sibling relationships. Rory would bring sandwiches, and Juniper would bring art supplies, and they'd spend hours just being together. Pox joined them often, having become something of an honorary uncle to all 3 youngsters. He'd bring his metal detector and lead treasure hunts that kept the kids engaged while the adults talked through the complex logistics of blending their lives. Silas, who had initially been skeptical of the entire situation, was won over the first time he saw Juniper automatically cut Emma's sandwich diagonally and remove the crusts, exactly the way she'd done it years before, a detail Rory had never mentioned to anyone. I owe you an apology, Silas told Rory quietly one afternoon. I was so focused on protecting you from disappointment that I couldn't see the miracle right in front of us. The miracle wasn't simple or immediate. Juniper's memories returned in fragments, the smell of Emma's baby shampoo, the feeling of Rory's hand in hers, the sound of their laughter echoing through the house on Sycamore Street. But she also retained the deep love she'd developed for Lachlan and Corliss, and they remained her primary concern. I don't want to choose between my families, she told Dr. Reed during one of their sessions. I want to find a way to honor both the mother I was and the mother I became. Who says you have to choose? Dr. Reed asked. Families come in all shapes. Love multiplies, it doesn't divide. Emma, with the adaptability of youth, embraced her new siblings with enthusiasm. She taught Corliss to paint watercolors and helped Lachlan build elaborate fort structures in the backyard. When people asked if it was strange having a mom who didn't remember her, Emma would shrug and say, She's learning to remember, and I'm learning who she is now. It's like making a new friend who's also your family. By the end of the month, they'd established a rhythm that felt sustainable. Juniper would spend 3 days a week in their hometown, slowly reacquainting herself with the life she'd forgotten, and 4 days in Millbrook Valley with Lachlan and Corliss. It wasn't perfect, but it was working. The true test came when Emma asked if she could stay overnight in Millbrook Valley for the first time. "I want to see where you live now," she told Juniper. "I want to see your house and meet your neighbors and understand the life you built." That night, as Rory tucked Emma into the spare bed in Juniper's small house, with Lachlan and Corliss already asleep in their own rooms, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, the peace of a complete family, even if it looked nothing like the family they'd once been. Love, he realized, was infinitely creative in finding ways to heal what seemed irreparably broken. 8 months later, the Vance Shaw household buzzed with the chaotic energy of a family preparing for Emma's 9th birthday party. The house on Sycamore Street had been expanded with a sunroom addition that served as an art studio for Juniper and homework space for the 3 youngsters, and a converted garage that had become Lachlan's workshop where he built intricate wooden puzzles under Rory's patient guidance. Juniper stood in the kitchen, simultaneously frosting Emma's requested chocolate cake with rainbow sprinkles and helping Corliss with her multiplication tables. Her memory had returned in substantial pieces over the past months. Not everything, but enough to feel like herself again. She remembered Emma's first steps, their wedding day, the smell of the garden they'd planted together. But she also retained the complete 3 years of loving Lachlan and Corliss, and those memories felt equally precious. "Mama, does 17 times 4 equal 68? Corliss asked, pencil poised over her worksheet. "Check it by adding 17 4 times, Juniper suggested, using the patient tone that had become second nature. Through years of helping with homework in both her lives, Emma burst through the kitchen door, still wearing her soccer uniform and grinning broadly. "We won. Coach said I had the best assist of the season." She paused, studying the cake. "Did you remember to make the frosting extra sweet?" "Of course I did," Juniper laughed, dabbing a spot of frosting on Emma's nose. "Some things are too important to forget, even when you actually forgot everything." Emma teased, a joke that had become comfortable family shorthand for the complexity of their situation. "Especially then," Juniper replied, pulling her daughter into a brief hug. "My heart remembered the important things even when my mind couldn't." The past 8 months had been a masterclass in patience, flexibility, and the daily miracle of building trust. Initially, Rory and Juniper had felt like strangers learning to be married again. They'd slept in separate bedrooms for the first 3 months, slowly rediscovering their rhythm as partners, while she splits her time between their hometown and Millbrook Valley. But gradually, naturally, they'd found their way back to each other. Not to the exact relationship they'd had before. Too much growth and change had happened for that, but to something deeper and more intentional. They'd had to choose each other again, every day, and that choosing felt more meaningful than the unconscious love of their earlier marriage. "Dad's home," Lachlan called from the living room, where he'd been assembling party decorations with the focused intensity of someone who took celebration logistics very seriously. Rory entered the kitchen carrying grocery bags and wearing the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone who'd just supervised 3 9-year-olds picking out party supplies. "I've learned that 4th graders have very strong opinions about balloon colors," he announced. "Also, we may have purchased enough chips to feed a small army." "Better too much than too little," Juniper said, kissing his cheek in the casual way that had gradually returned to their relationship. "How was the consultation with Mrs. Hartwell?" Rory's carpentry business had expanded significantly over the past year, partly because word had spread about his story, the man whose wife had returned from the dead, and people seemed to believe that someone who'd experienced such a miracle might bring good luck to their home improvement projects. Mrs. Hartwell wanted him to build custom bookshelves for her library, and she'd specifically requested the man whose love brought his wife home. "She wants built-ins for the entire east wall," Rory said, setting groceries on the counter. "And she asked if Juniper might be interested in painting a mural above them." "Really?" Juniper's eyes lit up. Her illustration work had grown from the library newsletter to commissions for local businesses, and even a small publishing house that specialized in regional children's books. Discovering that she could make art for a living again had been one of the most healing parts of reclaiming her identity. I told her I'd ask the artist herself, Rory said with a smile that still held traces of wonder at having his wife back to ask. The afternoon party was a testament to how seamlessly their expanded family had integrated into the community. Emma's classmates played with Lachlan and Corliss as if they'd always been siblings. Neighbors who had supported Rory through 3 years of single parenthood now embraced Juniper as someone who'd been through her own difficult journey. Pox arrived with a metal detector and organized a treasure hunt that kept 12 youngsters engaged for an hour. Silas and his wife Kira had driven down from the city with their own kids, who'd quickly bonded with their new extended cousins. "You." "No," Silas told Rory as they watched the chaos of 9-year-olds playing capture the flag. "I spent 3 years worrying about Emma growing up without a mother, and now she's got more family than she knows what to do with." "Funny how life works out," Rory replied, watching Juniper referee a disagreement about flag-hiding rules with the diplomatic skill of someone who'd learned to navigate complex family dynamics. Dr. Reed, who had become a family friend rather than just a professional contact, observed the interactions with the satisfaction of someone whose careful work had contributed to something beautiful. "You've created something remarkable here," she told Juniper during a quiet moment. "Not just a reunion, but a genuine integration of multiple loves and loyalties." "It wasn't easy," Juniper admitted. "There were days when I felt like I was being pulled in 3 directions, trying to be the mother Emma remembered, the mother Lachlan and Corliss needed, and the wife Rory fell in love with. I had to learn that I could be all of those things without losing myself." As the party wound down and families headed home, the 5 core members of their reconstructed family settled in the living room for the traditional birthday story time. This had become one of their most cherished rituals evenings, when they'd gather with hot chocolate and take turns sharing stories, both remembered and newly created. "Tell the elephant story," Corliss requested, curling up next to Juniper on the couch. The elephant story had become family legend. How Emma had painted the small ceramic elephant for Mother's Day, how it had survived the accident and traveled with Juniper to Millbrook Valley, how Lachlan had noticed it and declared that it meant she was supposed to take care of precious things. The elephant now held a place of honor on the mantel, surrounded by photos from both eras of their family's existence. "Once upon a time," Juniper began, "there was a little girl who painted an elephant for someone she loved very much. As she told the familiar story, Rory watched his daughter lean against her mother's shoulder while Lachlan absently played with a wooden puzzle, and Corliss traced patterns on Juniper's arm. This was what normal looked like, now not the same normal they'd had before, but something richer and more complex. After the youngsters were tucked into bed, Emma in her original room, Lachlan and Corliss in the rooms they'd claimed during the gradual transition to living primarily at the Sycamore Street house, Rory and Juniper sat on the front porch, swing he'd rebuilt to accommodate their expanded family. "Do you ever think about the path not taken?" Juniper asked, her head resting on his shoulder. "What our life would have been like if the accident hadn't happened?" "Sometimes," Rory admitted. "But then I think about Lachlan and Corliss and how empty their lives would have been without you. I think about how much stronger Emma has become from learning to love siblings who came to her through tragedy. I think about how much deeper our marriage feels now that we've had to choose each other again instead of just assuming we'd always be together. I used to feel guilty about the 3 years I lost," Juniper said. "All the milestones I missed with Emma, all the ways you had to be both parents. But Dr. Reed helped me understand that those years weren't lost. They were spent keeping 2 other youngsters alive and helping them heal. That matters too." "The night of the accident," Rory said quietly, "I thought our story was over. I thought I'd be spending the rest of my life trying to be enough parent for Emma while missing the other half of myself. I never imagined that love could be so expandable. Pac says he's writing a book about impossible cases that turned out to be possible, Juniper said with a laugh. He wants to call it When the Dead Come Home. Terrible title. I suggested Love Finds a Way, but he said that was too romantic for a detective story. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of their neighborhood settling into evening dogs barking, televisions murmuring through open windows, the distant sound of teenagers laughing in someone's backyard. It was the soundtrack of ordinary life, the kind of beautiful mundane that Rory had once taken for granted and now treasured as proof of the miraculous. The school counselor asked Emma what she wanted to be when she grows up, Juniper said. Do you know what she told her? Artist like you? A family finder. She said there are probably lots of families who are missing pieces of themselves, and someone should help them figure out how to fit back together. Rory's chest tightened with pride and love for the remarkable young woman their daughter was becoming. That sounds like Emma. She also said she wants to have 6 kids of her own someday, because she's learned that families can be as big as your heart can stretch. Well, she's definitely learned that from experience. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Rory thought about the newspaper photograph that had started this entire journey. If someone had told him 8 months ago that he'd be sitting on his front porch with a wife who'd returned from the dead, planning art projects and carpentry jobs and birthday parties for a daughter, who now had 2 siblings who'd arrived through tragedy and love, he'd have assumed they were describing an impossible fantasy. But the impossible had become their beautiful, complicated, perfectly imperfect reality. I love you, he told Juniper, words that carried the weight of 3 years of grief, 8 months of rebuilding, and a lifetime of commitment to whatever came next. I love you too, she replied. All of you, all of us. This whole ridiculous, wonderful family we've managed to build from the pieces of broken hearts. Inside the house, the elephant figurine caught the moonlight streaming through the living room window, standing sentinel over a family that had learned the most important truth of all. Love doesn't end when memory fails. Death seems final, or circumstances tear people apart. Love finds a way to survive, to grow, to welcome newcomers, and to write new chapters that honor both what was lost and what was found. Sometimes, the miracle isn't getting back exactly what you had before. Sometimes the miracle is discovering that what you can build from the fragments is more beautiful than anything you could have imagined. And sometimes, just sometimes, love really does find a way home, not to the place it started, but to the place it was always meant to be. 2 years have passed since that life-changing morning when Rory Vance first saw his wife's face staring back at him from a small-town newspaper. Today, as I write this story, the Vance Shaw family has become something of a local legend, not just for the miraculous reunion that defied death itself, but for the way they've redefined what family can look like when love refuses to accept the boundaries that life tries to impose. The house on Sycamore Street now bears little resemblance to the quiet, grief-stricken home where Rory once raised Emma alone. A tire swing hangs from the old oak tree in the backyard, Lackland's engineering project that took 3 attempts and considerable guidance from his adoptive father. Corliss's artwork covers the refrigerator in layers, each piece carefully preserved because, as Juniper learned, every drawing tells a story worth keeping. Emma's soccer trophies share shelf space with Juniper's art awards and Rory's woodworking. Ribbons from the county fair, creating a visual timeline of a family that grew not through conventional means, but through the kind of persistence that believes in impossible things. The workshop behind the house has become Rory's most successful business venture yet. Word of his story spread far beyond their small town, and clients now travel from 3 states away to commission work from the carpenter whose love brought his wife back from the dead. They come seeking more than furniture. They come hoping that some of that miracle magic might rub off on their own impossible situations. Rory builds their cabinets and bookshelves with the same patience he's learned to apply to rebuilding a family, and every piece that leaves his workshop carries with it a story about the power of refusing to give up. Juniper's art studio occupies the converted garage, its north-facing windows providing perfect light for the illustrations that have made her one of the region's most sought-after children's book artists. Her latest project, a series about siblings who find each other through unexpected circumstances, has caught the attention of a major publishing house. But more importantly, it's provided a way for her to process and share the complex emotions of loving multiple families simultaneously without having to choose between them. The beautiful thing about Juniper's story, Dr. Fiona Reed told me during our interview, is that it challenges our assumptions about memory, identity, and the nature of love itself. We tend to think of memory as the foundation of who we are, but her experience proves that love can exist independently of memory. The heart knows things the mind cannot access. Dr. Reed has continued to work with the family, not as a therapist, but as a researcher documenting the long-term effects of profound amnesia recovery within complex family structures. Their case has been written about in medical journals and presented at conferences, contributing to a growing understanding of how trauma survivors can build meaningful lives even when the past remains partially inaccessible. The key insight, Dr. Reed explains, is that healing doesn't require complete memory recovery. Juniper didn't need to remember every detail of her previous life to reclaim her identity as Emma's mother. What mattered was creating space for love to grow again, even when it looked different than before. Pox Thorne has indeed written his book, though he ended up calling it The Return, When Love Refuses to Accept Death. It's become a bestseller in the true crime and inspirational memoir categories, with all proceeds from the chapter about the Vance Shaw family going toward a scholarship fund for orphaned youngsters in the region. Pox has become something of a local celebrity himself, frequently called upon to investigate cases that other professionals have dismissed as impossible. People ask me all the time if I believe in miracles now, Pox says during our conversation. At his office, which is still cluttered with case files of the inexplicable, I tell them I've always believed in miracles, I just used to call them cases that needed more investigation. The difference between impossible and unlikely is usually just the amount of effort someone's willing to put into finding the truth. Emma, now 11 and startlingly articulate about complex emotional concepts, has indeed maintained her desire to become what she calls a family finder. She volunteers at the local animal shelter, where she's developed a reputation for matching difficult-to-place pets with families who need them most. Her teacher reports that she writes essays about the importance of collecting people who need love, and her guidance counselor notes that she has an unusual gift for helping other youngsters navigate family conflicts. The thing about having a mom who died and came back, Emma told me with the matter-of-fact wisdom that seems to characterize her generation, is that you learn not to take anything for granted. Like, every day I get to have breakfast with my family is basically a miracle. Most kids don't think about that, but I do. It makes regular stuff feel special. Lachlan, now 10, has discovered a passion for woodworking under Rory's guidance and shows remarkable aptitude for both the technical and artistic aspects of carpentry. His pieces, small boxes with intricate joinery, carved animals with surprising personality, sell at the local craft fair, with proceeds going toward his college fund. But more significantly, working with his hands has given him a way to process the early trauma of losing his birth parents and the joy of finding a new family. Building things teaches you that broken doesn't mean worthless, Lachlan says, sanding a small wooden elephant he's crafted as a birthday gift for Juniper. Dad, Rory showed me that you can take pieces that don't seem to fit together and make something beautiful if you're patient and you pay attention to how they want to connect. Corliss, the artist of the family at 8 years old, creates paintings that seem to capture emotions rather than just images. Her latest series, which hangs in Juniper's studio, depicts families in various configurations, some traditional, some blended, some chosen rather than blood-related. When asked to explain her art, she simply says, "I paint love in all its shapes. The integration hasn't been without challenges." There were difficult conversations about last names. Should Lachlan and Corliss become Vances, or should the whole family become Vance Shaws? They settled on individual choice. Emma remained Emma Vance. Lachlan chose Lachlan Vance Shaw, and Corliss decided on Corliss Shaw Vance because, in her words, "I want both names, but I want Shaw first because Mama was Shaw when she found me." There were practical complications to school registrations, medical records, legal guardianship papers that needed updating to reflect their new reality. Rory and Juniper chose to renew their wedding vows in a small ceremony that included all three youngsters as participants, creating new legal and symbolic bonds that honored both their original commitment and their expanded understanding of what marriage could encompass. "The hardest part," Juniper reflects, "was learning to forgive myself for the time I couldn't remember, and learning to trust that loving Lachlan and Corliss didn't diminish my love for Emma and Rory. I had to understand that the heart isn't a pie where giving one person a bigger slice means everyone else gets less. Love expands to fill whatever space you create for it." The ripple effects of their story continue to spread through their community and beyond. The Millbrook Valley Harvest Festival now includes an annual Second Chances booth where families who've experienced loss, adoption, foster care, or blended family situations can connect and share resources. The local library has started a support group for people dealing with amnesia and traumatic memory loss, led by Juniper and Dr. Reed. Perhaps most significantly, their story has inspired others to look more carefully at their own impossible situations. The hospital where Juniper was initially treated has implemented new protocols for identifying unknown patients, including more extensive outreach to surrounding communities and longer-term follow-up care for amnesia cases. 3 other families in the region have been reunited after their cases were reopened using techniques Pox developed during his investigation of Juniper's disappearance. "The thing about miracles," Silas told me during our interview, "is that they're not really about supernatural intervention. They're about people refusing to accept that love has limits. My brother could have given up searching. Juniper could have chosen to avoid the pain of trying to remember. Those youngsters could have remained in the foster system. But everybody involved made the harder choice, the choice to believe that healing was possible even when logic said otherwise." As our conversation draws to a close, I'm sitting in the Vance Shaw family's living room on a Sunday afternoon, watching what has become their weekly tradition of collaborative cooking. Emma is teaching Corliss how to measure flour properly, while Lachlan helps Rory fix a wobbly table leg. Juniper moves between both activities, offering guidance on baking technique and holding screws in place, her presence somehow making everyone else's tasks easier. The elephant figurine still sits on the mantel, but it's no longer alone. It's surrounded by photographs from both eras of their family's existence, artwork created by all 3 youngsters, and small mementos from the adventures they've shared since reuniting. The collection tells a story of love that survived death, memory that transcended trauma, and family that redefined itself through choice rather than circumstance. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't seen that newspaper photo? I ask Rory. He considers the question while watching his wife demonstrate the proper way to fold egg whites, his expression peaceful in a way that suggests someone who's learned to appreciate rather than question his good fortune. "I used to think finding Juniper was the miracle," he says finally. "But I've realized that the real miracle was all of us choosing to believe that broken things could be made whole again." The newspaper was just the beginning. The miracle was everything that came after. As I prepare to leave, Emma runs up with a drawing she's made during our conversation. It's the elephant figurine, but in her rendering, it's surrounded by tiny hearts in rainbow colors, each one labeled with a family member's name. At the bottom, in her careful handwriting, she's written, "Love finds a way to bring everyone home." Looking at this family built through tragedy, strengthened by choice, and sustained by the daily decision to believe in each other, I'm reminded that the most powerful stories aren't about extraordinary people experiencing supernatural events. They're about ordinary people who refuse to accept that love has limitations, that families must follow traditional patterns, or that endings are ever truly final. The Vance Shaw family proves that sometimes the most profound miracles happen not through divine intervention, but through human persistence. Through the decision to keep looking when others have stopped searching. Through the willingness to rebuild rather than simply replace what was lost. Through the courage to love again even when love has already caused tremendous pain. If you're facing your own impossible situation, if you're missing someone you can't find, if you're trying to rebuild something that seems irreparably broken, if you're wondering whether hope is worth maintaining when logic says otherwise, remember this. Family. Remember that miracles often come disguised as coincidences, that love is more creative than we give it credit for, and that families can be built and rebuilt in ways we never thought possible. And remember that sometimes, just sometimes, the most impossible thing of all turns out to be true. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.